Why did God create the universe, human beings, and suffering? By Malcolm Bowden. Preliminary comment. In converting what was originally an essay into this video format, I thought I would take the opportunity to provide pictures, drawings, and even animations to add to the interest. Having started to draft some out, I quickly came to realize that far from enhancing the subject, they tended to trivialize it. I therefore present this deeply thought-provoking subject as text only. I did not want to distract the reader from meditating on what I think is surely the most profound question that any thoughtful person could possibly ask. My interest in this subject began as two quite separate questions I had long puzzled over. The first was, 1. Why is there suffering in this world? Why is it so important to God that he put it right in the very heart of the crucifixion? The second question, to begin with quite unrelated to the first, was 2. Why are there just 3 persons in the Trinity? Why not 2 or 4 or more? As I pondered upon them, I gradually realized that they were very closely linked, the explanation for one throwing light upon the other. Adam's test. In Genesis, God put Adam in a perfect setting, and Adam responded with perfect mutual love towards God to begin with. However, it is extremely important to note that although God loved Adam, he nevertheless set a simple test for his trust in God's love towards him by placing the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden and then warning Adam that he must not eat of this tree. This was done as a test of Adam's love and trust. If this is so, then we have here an important and most profound consideration, which is that to establish that the love is true, there needs to be some means that will visibly demonstrate that that love has been rejected. The nature of true Christian agape love. It is well known that the Greek language has 4 words to convey the various types of love for which we have only the one. These 4 are eros, sexual desire; storge, the deep love of, say, a mother for her child and similar close bonds of family; phileo, the close ties of friendship that can bind 2 or more together; agape, the active demonstration of love towards others, irrespective of their feelings or attitudes. In his book, The Danger of Self-Love, by Baker Bookhouse, Paul Brownback quotes a number of Greek scholars who define the use of these 2 words, phileo and agape. Phileo, to cherish, love in the sense of personal attachment, by F. Godet. The feeling of natural love, by B. F. Westcott. Agape, the thought of selection, of willed address and readiness for action, E. Stauffer. A clear determination of the will, W. Evans. A spiritual affection which follows the direction of the will, and which, therefore, unlike that feeling which is instinctive and unreasoned, can be commanded as a duty. G. Abbott Smith. It is when we understand this aspect of Christian love that we can begin to truly love our enemies. We are not asked to first have a warm affection for them, but to simply act selflessly towards them. Here we can catch a glimpse of how much higher agape love is than the more feelings-centered and therefore more changeable phileo love. A. The need for a duality. John 4 verses 8b says, God is love. Love cannot be demonstrated by any one person on their own. So there is a minimum need of two persons within the Godhead from all eternity past to eternity future. This indeed exposes a major error in the theology of the Jehovah's Witnesses. God is love in all its totality. But if there was a time when there was no one he could love, he could not really be said to be love. It is therefore necessary for there to have been at least one other person, the Son, from all eternity past. The need for a Trinity. With two persons in the Godhead, love could then be expressed between them. But with only one other person in existence, there was no one else that could be loved. So there was no real test. This conclusion gives us the theological basis for the Trinity. With this number, there is then always the test of the true depth of a person's selfless love for another, for there is the potential emotion of jealousy being aroused. With three people, if any one of them truly loves another, they will actually rejoice on seeing their beloved being made happy by the love of the third person. If they are jealous of that love, then there is an immediate element of self-centeredness in their reaction, and this is obviously non-existent within the Godhead. We therefore have a picture forming of three people loving each other in a totally selfless way and delighting to selflessly encourage the love between the other two, such that they are binding each other closer together in the unbreakable tight bonds of love. But is there yet one other test that could be applied? I would suggest that there is, and it is here that we must turn to the main subject of this paper, the Trinity and suffering. Whilst the love within the Trinity was tested, there would always be a further question that might be asked by an outside witness, if such could be imagined. It might be asked, is this love strong enough for one to love another, even though their love is, or might be, rejected? To put it another way, it is easy for a person to love another, provided that love is either reciprocated or at the very least not repulsed. Christ raised this very point when he said, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Therefore you shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Matthew 5, verses 43 to 48. This demonstration of the depth of the love that exists within the Godhead involves a theological problem, however. To carry out the test required the rejection of love and the consequent hatred by the one beloved. How could this test be made when all the persons of the Trinity were without sin and could never sin? I therefore consider that the Trinity deliberately created this universe with fallible human beings who could fall and sin, but nevertheless the Trinity would continue to love them, even allowing them to torture their own God, who loved them so much that he would nevertheless forgive them for their terrible actions and totally self-centered attitude to others. Thus, the Trinity provided a means whereby the depth of their love for those who hated them could be tried, tested, and proclaimed before the whole universe of living creatures. That this is a correct interpretation is indicated in Romans 9, verses 17 to 24. Here we have mankind questioning God's seeming unfairness by choosing only some people who will be saved, and God saying man has no right to question God, and he will not answer that question. I call it God's brick wall. Paul continues by stating, "What if God endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he has prepared beforehand for glory?" Here then we have the theological need for the centrality of the infinite degree of suffering that Christ experienced on the cross, in what I call the drama of the universe. God will then have shown the full extent of his love, even for those who had rebelled against him, flung his love back in his face, and then cruelly murdered his son. The different tests. Let me pause here and point out the huge difference between the testing of Adam and that of Christ. Adam had merely to resist the temptation and not eat of the fruit. Christ had to continue to suffer terrible physical pain and condemnation for sin, and not come down from the cross. What a different level of testing they each had. Christ's question. One of Christ's sayings upon the cross has always intrigued me. When he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was not the forsaking that is not understood, but the fact that Christ put it as a question. I have heard it said that when Christ spoke those words, he did it simply to repeat the opening words of Psalm 22, so that those around him would go home, look at it, and see that it predicted his death. To me, this is a very shallow and incorrect reason for Christ uttering those terrible words. In John 16:31 to 32, he predicts that the disciples will desert him, but then he says, "Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me." Is it not possible that he was expecting to go through the crucifixion with the Father supporting him, only to find that he was to go through it alone? He then asked the very human question, why? Surely this was the time when his faith was being tested. Christ had to endure the cross without the strengthening presence of his Father. In a like manner, most Christians have to face their problems and go through their trials without any sense of the real presence of God. Here, surely, our faith is truly tested, and from it can come a deeper sense of his great love for us as individuals. Despite the severity of our testing, we can nevertheless exercise our faith and rest in the knowledge of his goodness towards us, and that such trials will ultimately be seen as a vital part of his plan for our purification. What happened on the cross? Without the presence of the Father, was Christ placed in the same position as Adam when he, Adam, fell? Adam had the freedom to choose whether to obey God or rebel against him. Was Christ placed in the same position, able to reject the Father's will should he wish, or was he not able to do so because he was still God and still perfect? Was Christ free to sin? This question was encapsulated in an old Latin tag in which the reversing of the first two words makes all the difference. Non posse peccare. It was not possible for him to sin. He was still God and therefore perfect and could not sin. Posse non peccare. It was possible for him not to sin, opening up the possibility that it was possible for him to sin. Certainly, it is the second that is the nearest to Adam's situation before he rebelled. Adam was able to sin and chose to do so. I am sure Christ was placed in exactly the same position. If it was not possible for Christ to sin on the cross, then he would have had to hang there and would not have been able to come down. Then the whole experience on the cross would not have been a test of his obedience to God. The perfection of Christ. There are several verses in the New Testament that speak about the perfection or completion of Christ. Hebrews 2:10. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Hebrews 5:9. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. Luke 13:32. And on the third day I will be perfected. How can Christ, who is absolutely perfect, then be perfected any further? Surely this is solved if we see that it is his passing the test of obedience, of resisting sin under great pressure, which had never before been experienced by any member of the Trinity. Surely that is the additional experience to the glory he experienced in heaven that fully completes his being. When the Roman soldiers nailed him to the cross and gambled for his clothes, they were totally oblivious of the fact that they were fulfilling the prophecies written 1,000 years before, when David wrote Psalm 22, verses 16b and 18. I find this gives me a very great sense of peace to know that God is in control of everything. The fact that God is in total control of all events and histories could sometimes seem as if he is playing a huge game of chess, moving people about the board in a detached attitude. This interpretation is wickedly wrong, because he was prepared to cruelly punish his own son upon the cross to save those who were rebels against him. His deep personal involvement demonstrates that every act is being played out in cosmic dimensions. God is not playing games with anyone. Perfection and the need for suffering. This question of the existence of suffering in God's world can be examined from quite a different angle. It is 1. Indisputable that God is perfect in all that he does. He has never made a mistake and never will. 2. It is equally certain that God has total knowledge of the past, present, and the future. He created Adam as perfect man and gave him the freedom to reject his love. Knowing that Adam would do so, he had already made plans for man's eventual redemption and return to a loving relationship to himself, with a relationship that would be even closer than that originally enjoyed by Adam. Bearing in mind these 2 points, if God is perfect and knew all that would follow from Adam's fall, we can only conclude that of all the possible worlds that God could have planned, nevertheless, this is the best of all possible worlds, and that takes into account all the suffering. Thus, by a quite separate route, the importance of suffering in God's plan is shown to be a vital ingredient. The questions that now have to be faced concern the outworking of that ingredient in the lives of men and women in the world today. The Christian's reaction to suffering. For those undergoing suffering at this moment, we can say, God has chosen you to have the opportunity to display your Christian faith and love before a watching world. He is also testing your faith in him, and you can now demonstrate its strength by showing that you are willing to trust in his real goodness towards you. You can trust him despite his seeming to be absent, his failure to answer your prayers, and everything giving the appearance of his hating you and punishing you unjustly, for you are sharing in Christ's suffering. Your faith can be made even stronger by this refining test, for you are able to hold on to the fact that despite all appearances, he is truly a loving God who cares deeply for all his chosen children. It is hoped that those who are suffering at present, and those who may yet be tested in the furnace, may know that inward strengthening that can come from a right understanding that God does indeed have a vital purpose in allowing it to take place. In any such suffering, we have an opportunity to mature our faith, a maturity that will be not just a help and a comfort in this passing world, but giving a glorious reward for all eternity. Malcolm Bowden.